The year is 717. The greatest city in the world is surrounded. 2,000 Arab warships block the horizon like a forest of death. Inside the walls, mothers clutch their starving children. Outside, an army of 200,000 warriors sharpens their blades, waiting for the kill. Constantinople, the last fortress of Christianity, has mere weeks to live. Every previous enemy who reached these walls has either conquered or died trying. But this time, the defenders possess something the attackers have never seen. Something that doesn't just kill. Something that makes the sea itself burn. In the coming months, this secret weapon will turn the greatest siege in history into the most terrifying massacre ever witnessed on water. If you're fascinated by the untold stories that changed the world, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me which historical mystery you want uncovered next. You won't believe what happens in this story. The scouts saw them first on a cold morning in August 717. Not dozens of ships. Not hundreds. 2,000 vessels stretching across the Sea of Marmara like a plague of locusts on water. Each sail bore the green banner of the Umayyad Caliphate, the largest empire the world had ever known. From the walls of Constantinople, Emperor Leo III watched the fleet approach, and he knew what every citizen already understood in their bones. The moment of reckoning had arrived. For nearly a century, the Arab Caliphate had been unstoppable. They had swept through Persia like wildfire, consumed Egypt in months, transformed North Africa into Islamic territory, and crossed into Spain. Every great city that stood before them had fallen. Damascus, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Carthage. Now they wanted the greatest prize of all, Constantinople, the queen of cities, the jewel that connected Europe and Asia, the fortress that had never been conquered in over 300 years. But this wasn't the first time the Arabs had tried. In 674, they came with everything they had, besieging the city for 4 brutal years. Constantinople held, barely. Now, in 717, they returned with twice the ships, twice the soldiers, and a leader who had sworn on the Quran itself that he would either take the city or die trying. Caliph Sulayman had sent his brother, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, to finish what their predecessors could not. Maslama was not a man who failed. He commanded 200,000 of the finest warriors in the Islamic world. His siege engines were the most advanced ever constructed. His strategy was flawless. He would blockade the city by sea, surround it by land, starve the population into submission, and then storm the walls when resistance collapsed. It was the same formula that had worked everywhere else. There was no reason it wouldn't work here. Inside the city, panic spread like disease. Merchants hoarded grain. Nobles fled to their country estates. Priests filled the churches with desperate prayers. The population of 500,000 knew the mathematics of siege warfare. Even with rationing, their food would last 6 months at most. After that, surrender or starvation. And surrender to Maslama meant only one thing: the end of Constantinople, the end of the Byzantine Empire, and the end of Christian power in the East. Emperor Leo III stood on the Theodosian walls and watched the enemy fleet anchor in perfect formation. He was not a man who showed fear, but even he understood the odds. His army numbered barely 15,000 fighting men. He had no allies coming to save him. No relief force was marching from the west. The entire Christian world was fractured, weak, and terrified. Constantinople stood alone against the most powerful military machine in existence. But Leo had something Maslama didn't know about. Something hidden in fortified workshops beneath the imperial palace. Something that had been guarded as the most precious secret of the Byzantine state for generations. A weapon so devastating, so terrifying, that even emperors feared what it could do. It had saved Constantinople before. Now, Leo would have to gamble everything that it could save the city again. As night fell on that first day of the siege, torches lit up across the Arab fleet like stars on black water. 2,000 ships. Enough sailors and marines to overwhelm any navy in the world. Moslama stood on the deck of his flagship and smiled. He could already see himself riding through the streets of conquered Constantinople, the greatest victory in Islamic history. His name would be remembered forever. What he couldn't see, hidden in the darkness of the Golden Horn harbor, were the Byzantine fire ships being prepared. Strange copper tubes were being mounted on their prows. Thick, oily liquid was being loaded into bronze tanks. Crews of specially trained sailors were receiving their final orders. And in the imperial palace, Leo gave the command that would change everything. Tomorrow, the Arabs would learn why Constantinople had never fallen. Tomorrow, they would discover that some weapons are not meant to wound. They're meant to create nightmares. The weapon had a name whispered in fear across every sea: Greek fire. But calling it fire was like calling a hurricane a breeze. This was something else entirely. Something that burned on water. Something that couldn't be extinguished. Something that turned men into living torches and ships into floating crematoriums. And most terrifying of all, nobody outside a handful of Byzantine officials knew how it was made. The formula was the most closely guarded secret in the empire. It was never written down. It was passed orally from one imperial chemist to another, always under threat of death for betrayal. Emperors protected it more carefully than their own crowns because they understood a fundamental truth. This weapon was the only reason Constantinople still existed. Without it, the city would have fallen decades ago. The ingredients remain mysterious even today, lost to history when the Byzantine Empire finally collapsed centuries later. Historians believe it contained petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and naphtha, mixed in proportions that created a substance more terrifying than anything else in medieval warfare. When pressurized and sprayed through bronze siphons, it erupted in flames so intense they could melt armor and boil the sea itself. But the genius wasn't just in the formula. It was in the delivery system. Byzantine engineers had designed specialized ships called dromons, equipped with rotating bronze tubes mounted on their bows. These siphons could spray Greek fire in concentrated streams up to 50 feet, engulfing enemy vessels before they could even get close. The liquid stuck to everything it touched: wood, cloth, flesh, water, and burned with such ferocity that sailors would throw themselves into the sea to escape, only to discover that the flames followed them beneath the waves. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Imagine being a sailor on an enemy ship, watching a Byzantine dromon approach. You've heard rumors about the fire weapon, but you don't really believe them. How can fire burn on water? It's impossible. Then you see a strange copper tube rotate toward your vessel. A moment later, a stream of liquid shoots across the gap. It looks almost harmless. Then it touches your ship's mast and the entire world becomes screaming orange hell. The flames don't spread slowly like normal fire. They explode across surfaces with unnatural speed. Your fellow sailors are running, burning, diving overboard. But the sea offers no salvation. The flames float on the surface, creating pools of liquid fire that cook men alive in their own armor. The screaming is worse than anything you've heard in battle. And there's nothing you can do. Water doesn't help. Sand doesn't help. The only thing that might work is vinegar or old urine, but in the chaos of burning ships and dying men, nobody remembers that. Panic destroys discipline. And panic is exactly what Greek fire was designed to create. Emperor Leo III had witnessed its effects before. He knew that Maslama's fleet, no matter how large, had never encountered anything like this. The Arab navy had conquered across the Mediterranean using conventional tactics, boarding, ramming, superior numbers. They were brave, disciplined, and experienced. But bravery means nothing when your ship is melting around you. Discipline crumbles when your skin is on fire. Experience is useless when facing a weapon that defies every known law of nature. The Byzantines had approximately 30 dromons equipped with Greek fire siphons. 30 ships against 2,000. Under normal circumstances, it would be suicide to engage. But these weren't normal circumstances. Leo wasn't planning a conventional naval battle. He was planning psychological warfare on a scale the Arabs couldn't comprehend. As dawn broke on the second day of the siege, Maslama ordered his fleet to tighten the blockade. His ships moved closer to the harbor entrance, preparing to prevent any Byzantine vessel from escaping or any supply ship from entering. It was standard siege procedure. Cut off all access. Strangle the city slowly. What Maslama didn't know was that the Byzantines weren't trying to escape. They were preparing to attack. And in the pre-dawn darkness, 30 dromons were quietly rowing into position, their bronze siphons loaded, their crews ready to unleash hell. The trap was set. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The Arab fleet had made its first critical mistake. They had come too close. Maslama's admirals, confident in their overwhelming numbers, had positioned their ships in tight formation near the mouth of the Golden Horn. It was tactically sound for a blockade, overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, impossible for any Byzantine ship to break through. But it also meant that when the attack came, there would be nowhere to run. At first light on September 3, 717, the Byzantine dromons emerged from the harbor like predators from a cave. The Arab lookouts barely had time to shout warnings before the first Greek fire siphon erupted. A stream of liquid shot across the water, and the moment it touched the wooden hull of an Arab flagship, the vessel transformed into an inferno. The flames spread with impossible speed. Within seconds, the entire ship was engulfed. Sailors threw themselves overboard, but the fire followed them into the sea, creating expanding pools of flame that turned the water's surface into a cooking pot. Men screamed as they burned alive, thrashing in the waves, their bodies becoming torches that illuminated the horror for everyone watching. Then the second dromon fired, and the third, and the fourth. Streams of Greek fire arced across the morning sky like ribbons from hell. Each stream found its target. Each target became a pyre. The tightly packed Arab formation, designed for strength, became a death trap. Ships couldn't maneuver without colliding with their neighbors. Captains screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the roaring flames and dying men. Panic spreads faster than fire, and now the Arab fleet had both. Ships in the rear tried to row backward, crashing into vessels behind them. Ships in the middle attempted to scatter, fouling their oars on nearby hulls. The coordination that made the fleet powerful shattered in minutes. Discipline evaporated. Experienced sailors became terrified individuals desperately trying to survive something they couldn't fight or understand. The Byzantine dromons moved through the chaos methodically, like executioners working through a crowd. They targeted the largest ships first, the command vessels, the troop transports, the supply ships carrying siege equipment and food. Each blast of Greek fire was precisely aimed. Each hit was catastrophic. The Byzantines weren't just destroying ships. They were destroying morale, destroying confidence, destroying the Arab navy's belief in its own invincibility. Maslama watched from the shore, paralyzed by disbelief. His fleet, the largest assembled in a generation, was being slaughtered. Not outfought. Not outmaneuvered. Slaughtered. He had brought 2,000 ships to conquer Constantinople. In less than 2 hours, he lost 400 of them. 400 vessels turned to ash and floating wreckage. Thousands of his best sailors and marines dead or maimed. and the Byzantine dromons hadn't lost a single ship. The surviving Arab vessels finally broke formation and fled toward open water. The Byzantine dromons didn't pursue far. They didn't need to. The message had been delivered with absolute clarity. Come close to Constantinople's walls, and you will burn. The sea itself will become your grave. As the smoke cleared and the fires burned down to smoldering wrecks, the Byzantine crews returned to the Golden Horn as heroes. Citizens lined the walls, cheering until their voices gave out. Church bells rang across the city. For the first time since the siege began, hope replaced despair. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. But Emperor Leo didn't celebrate. He stood on the palace balcony, watching the blackened hulls drift on the current, and he knew the truth. He had won a battle, not the war. Moslama still commanded 1,600 ships and 200,000 soldiers. The blockade was damaged but not broken. Winter was coming, and with it, the real test. How long could Constantinople hold when food ran out? How long before desperation forced him to negotiate? And most dangerously, now that Moslama had seen Greek fire in action, he would adapt. He would find a way to counter it. The Arabs hadn't conquered half the known world by giving up after one defeat. The siege was just beginning. And the worst was yet to come. Moslama ibn Abd al-Malik was not a man who accepted failure. As his burned and broken fleet regrouped in the waters south of the city, he called his commanders together and did what great generals do. He learned from his mistake. The Greek fire was devastating, yes. But it wasn't invincible. It had limitations. And limitations could be exploited. First, the weapon had limited range. The Byzantine dromons needed to get within 50 feet to use their siphons effectively. That meant Arab ships could potentially overwhelm them with arrows and projectiles before they got close enough to fire. Second, the Byzantines only had about 30 dromons equipped with the weapon. 30 ships couldn't defend the entire coastline simultaneously. Third, and most importantly, Greek fire required calm seas to deploy effectively. If the weather turned rough, the delicate siphons couldn't aim accurately, and the liquid spray would scatter harmlessly. Moslama adjusted his strategy. Instead of maintaining a tight blockade close to the city, he would pull his fleet back to safer distances. His ships would form a loose perimeter that couldn't be easily attacked but could still prevent supply ships from reaching Constantinople. Meanwhile, his land forces would construct fortifications and settle in for a winter siege. Let time be the weapon. Let starvation do what fire could not. It was a sound plan. But Moslama had made a second critical miscalculation. He assumed his supply lines were secure. After all, his army controlled the entire surrounding countryside. His supply ships had free passage across the Sea of Marmara. Food, weapons, and reinforcements flowed freely from Syria and Egypt. Constantinople was isolated. He was not. Or so he believed. What Moslama didn't know was that Emperor Leo had been preparing for this siege for months before the Arabs arrived. Byzantine agents had been working secretly with the Bulgarian Khan Tervel, the fierce ruler of the nomadic tribes north of Constantinople. The Bulgarians were neither Christian nor Arab. They followed their own pagan traditions, but they understood power politics. And right now, it served their interests to keep Constantinople independent rather than let the Arabs control both sides of the Bosphorus. The deal was simple. If Tervel attacked the Arab army's supply lines and reinforcements, Leo would pay him in gold and grant him territory. It was a desperate gamble. The Bulgarians were historically enemies of Byzantium. They had raided and pillaged Byzantine lands for generations. But desperate times demanded strange alliances. In late September, as Moslama's army dug in for the winter siege, Khan Tervel struck. His mounted warriors swept down from the north like a storm of violence. They hit the Arab supply caravans first, slaughtering the guards and burning the provisions. Then they ambushed a massive reinforcement column of 30,000 Arab soldiers marching overland to join Maslama's army. The Battle of Adrianople was a massacre. The Arab reinforcements, exhausted from their long march and unprepared for a Bulgarian ambush, were cut to pieces. Tervel's cavalry surrounded them in open terrain and methodically destroyed them with arrows and lances. Of the 30,000 men who marched toward Constantinople, fewer than 5,000 survived to reach Maslama's camp. The rest were dead or enslaved. The psychological impact on Maslama's army was devastating. They had come expecting a quick siege and easy victory. Instead, they had lost hundreds of ships to Greek fire, and now their supply lines were being cut by barbarian raiders. Winter was approaching, and suddenly the besiegers faced the same question as the besieged. Did they have enough food to survive until spring? Maslama ordered immediate rationing. He sent urgent messages to Damascus demanding more supplies, more reinforcements, more ships. But the messages had to travel through Bulgarian-controlled territory. Many never arrived. And those that did reach Damascus faced a new problem. Caliph Suleiman, the man who had ordered this siege and sworn to take Constantinople, had died unexpectedly. The new caliph, Umar II, had different priorities. Suddenly, Maslama found himself leading a siege that his own government was losing interest in supporting. His fleet was damaged. His army was starving. Winter was coming. And Constantinople's walls remained as impregnable as ever. The hunter had become the hunted. And the real suffering had only just begun. Winter came early in 717, and it came with a cruelty that neither side had anticipated. Snow fell on the Byzantine walls and the Arab camps with equal indifference. Temperatures plunged. Winds howled across the exposed plains where Maslama's army had pitched their tents. And then the real killer arrived: hunger. Inside Constantinople, the grain stores were carefully rationed. Every citizen received a measured portion, just enough to survive. It wasn't comfortable, but Emperor Leo's advanced preparations meant the city could last through winter if discipline held. Children cried from hunger. The elderly grew weaker. But people survived, held together by the knowledge that surrender meant death or slavery anyway. Outside the walls, Maslama's army faced something worse. The supply lines from Syria and Egypt were now almost completely severed. Bulgarian raiders had made the overland routes too dangerous. Winter storms made sea transport unreliable. The reinforcements and provisions that Maslama desperately needed simply weren't arriving. The massive army that was supposed to starve Constantinople was starving itself. First, the horses died. Thousands of cavalry mounts, essential for communication and raiding, were slaughtered for meat. Then the pack animals. Then the siege beasts. Arab soldiers, who had come expecting to conquer the richest city in the world, found themselves eating boiled leather and fighting over scraps. Disease spread through the camps. Dysentery, typhus, and exposure killed more men than Byzantine weapons ever could. The Arab fleet suffered equally. Ships trapped by winter storms and Byzantine fire weapons were also running out of supplies. Sailors began deserting, rowing small boats across the Bosphorus to surrender to the Byzantines rather than starve aboard their vessels. Some tried to forage along the coastline but were ambushed by Bulgarian war parties or Byzantine raiding units. Maslama faced an impossible choice. Retreat meant admitting defeat and returning to Damascus in disgrace, possibly facing execution for failing the jihad. Continuing the siege meant watching his army slowly disintegrate from starvation and disease. And attacking the walls in winter, without adequate siege equipment or proper supplies, would be suicide. Constantinople's fortifications had never been breached by direct assault. Weakened, hungry men had no chance. He chose to hold. It was a commander's pride, perhaps, or faith that Allah would provide a miracle, or simply the calculation that dying in a failed siege was preferable to dying in disgrace at home. Whatever the reason, the Arab army remained in position through the brutal winter, suffering losses that no battle could inflict. Inside Constantinople, morale slowly improved. Citizens watched from the walls as the Arab camps grew quieter, smaller, more desperate. They saw the smoke from fewer and fewer cooking fires. They heard reports from spies and deserters about the starvation and disease ravaging the besiegers. For the first time in months, people began to believe they might actually survive. Emperor Leo used the winter to rotate his defenders, repair the walls, and maintain the Greek fire siphons. He also sent secret messages to the new caliph in Damascus, probing for a diplomatic solution. Maybe Umar too could be persuaded to order a withdrawal. Maybe they could negotiate a face-saving treaty. But the messages went unanswered. Maslama was on his own. By February 718, the situation had become absurd. The Arab army that had come to conquer Constantinople was trapped in a siege of its own making. They couldn't capture the city. They couldn't safely retreat. They couldn't get adequate supplies. They were prisoners of their own ambition, dying slowly in the frozen mud outside the most fortified city in the Christian world. But Maslama still had 1,600 ships and over 100,000 soldiers alive. Wounded, weakened, and demoralized, yes, but still a massive force. And spring was coming. With spring would come calmer seas, new supplies, and one last chance to achieve victory or at least an honorable retreat. The Byzantine scouts reported increased activity in the Arab camps as the weather warmed. Something was being planned. Some final gambit. And Emperor Leo knew that the most dangerous enemy is one with nothing left to lose. The siege was about to enter its final, bloodiest phase. Spring arrived in April 718, and with it came Maslama's last hope, a massive reinforcement fleet from Egypt. 400 fresh warships carrying supplies, siege equipment, and thousands of soldiers who hadn't spent the winter starving in the mud. When the lookouts spotted the Egyptian sails on the southern horizon, the Arab camps erupted in celebration. Finally, the siege could be completed. Finally, Constantinople would fall. But the Egyptian fleet brought more than just reinforcements. It brought a fatal overconfidence. The Egyptian commanders had heard about Greek fire, but they hadn't witnessed it. They believed the stories were exaggerated. Byzantine propaganda designed to create fear. They were professional naval officers who had conquered coastlines across North Africa. A few Byzantine fire ships didn't concern them. This would prove to be the deadliest mistake of the entire siege. Emperor Leo had been tracking the Egyptian fleet's approach for days through his spy network. He knew their numbers, their route, and their likely landing point. And he had prepared a welcoming committee that would make the September massacre look like a minor skirmish. This time, he wouldn't use just 30 dromons. He would deploy every Greek fire ship he had, along with conventional warships to cut off escape routes. This time, the Byzantines would hunt for complete annihilation. The Egyptian fleet entered the Sea of Marmara in tight formation, drums beating, soldiers singing victory songs. They were so confident that they didn't even bother with advanced scouts. 400 ships sailing toward what they believed would be a historic triumph. On the shore, Maslama watched with desperate hope. Everything depended on these reinforcements reaching him intact. The Byzantine fleet emerged from the Golden Horn at dawn on April 15, 718. This time, there were nearly 50 dromons equipped with Greek fire, supported by dozens of conventional warships. Emperor Leo himself took command from the flagship, wearing his imperial armor, sending a message that this battle was personal. Constantinople's survival depended on what happened in the next few hours. The Egyptian commanders saw the Byzantine fleet approaching and laughed. 50 ships against 400? Even with their mysterious fire weapon, the numbers were absurdly in Egypt's favor. They ordered their fleet to attack formation, confident that sheer mass would overwhelm whatever tricks the Byzantines attempted. The two fleets closed rapidly, the Egyptians rowing hard, eager to crush the defenders and relieve the siege. Then the first Greek fire siphon fired, and reality destroyed confidence in a single horrifying moment. The lead Egyptian vessel didn't just catch fire. It exploded into flames so intense that sailors on nearby ships felt their skin burning from the radiant heat. Before the crew could even react, the entire ship was a floating crematorium. Men dove overboard, but the sea around the burning vessel had become a lake of liquid fire. Their screams carried across the water, and suddenly the Egyptian sailors understood that every horror story they dismissed as propaganda was actually an understatement. The Byzantine dromons fanned out and began their methodical execution. Unlike the September battle, this time they had numbers and positioning on their side. The Egyptian fleet, compressed in their attack formation, couldn't maneuver. Ships crashed into each other trying to escape. Captains screamed contradictory orders. Discipline collapsed within minutes. Stream after stream of Greek fire poured into the Egyptian fleet. Each blast created a new inferno. Each inferno spread to neighboring ships. The tight formation that was supposed to be a strength became a death trap. Ships couldn't escape without colliding with their own allies. The wind carried the flames from vessel to vessel, and the Byzantine conventional warships blocked the retreat routes, trapping the Egyptians in a killing zone. The Battle of the Marmara lasted less than 3 hours. When it ended, more than 300 Egyptian ships were destroyed. Thousands of soldiers and sailors who had never even reached Constantinople were dead, drowned, or horribly burned. The reinforcements that Moslama desperately needed would never arrive. The supplies that could have sustained the siege for months were now ash floating on the current. From the walls of Constantinople, citizens watched the smoke rise and knew the truth. The siege was over. They had won. But Moslama hadn't accepted defeat yet. The destruction of the Egyptian fleet shattered any remaining hope of victory, but Moslama ibn Abd al-Malik refused to acknowledge reality. He had sacrificed too much, lost too many men, endured too much suffering to simply retreat in defeat. His pride, his faith, and his fear of execution demanded one final attempt. If he couldn't starve Constantinople into submission, and if he couldn't defeat their navy, then he would do what no army had successfully done in 300 years. He would storm the Theodosian walls. It was madness. Military experts across the medieval world considered Constantinople's fortifications to be impregnable. The Theodosian walls consisted of 3 layers of defense: a wide moat, an outer wall 40 feet high, and an inner wall 60 feet high with massive towers. Attackers who somehow crossed the moat and scaled the outer wall would find themselves trapped in a killing zone called the Peribolos, with defenders raining arrows, stones, and boiling oil from the inner walls above. But Moslama was beyond rational calculation. In May 718, he ordered his engineers to construct siege towers, battering rams, and assault ladders. His remaining soldiers, weakened from the winter and demoralized by the fleet's destruction, were commanded to prepare for a general assault. Many knew it was suicide. But desertion meant execution, and at least dying in assault offered the possibility of martyrdom and paradise. So they obeyed. Emperor Leo watched the preparations and recognized desperation when he saw it. Moslama was finished, and everyone knew it. But a desperate enemy is still dangerous. Cornered animals fight hardest. Leo ordered every defender to the walls and prepared for the assault he knew was coming. The attack began at dawn on May 22, 718. Thousands of Arab soldiers charged across the muddy ground toward the moat, carrying scaling ladders and pushing mobile siege towers. Drums thundered. Religious chants filled the air. It was a brave, futile gesture, the last gasp of an army that had already lost. The Byzantine defenders waited until the attackers reached the moat, then unleashed everything they had. Arrows fell like deadly rain. Ballistae launched massive bolts that punched through multiple men at once. Burning oil poured down from the walls, creating rivers of fire. Massive stones dropped from murder holes, crushing soldiers beneath the siege towers. The moat, designed specifically to prevent siege towers from reaching the walls, did its job perfectly. Towers became stuck in the mud, immobilized targets for Byzantine artillery. Some Arab warriors managed to cross the moat and raise ladders against the outer wall. A few even succeeded in reaching the top. But the moment they climbed over, they entered the peribolos and were cut down by defenders from the inner wall. There was no protection, no cover, no way to advance. The design was perfect. The execution was flawless. Maslama ordered wave after wave of attacks throughout the day. Each wave broke against the walls like water against stone. By evening, thousands of his men lay dead or dying in the moat and on the blood-soaked ground before the walls. Not a single Byzantine defender had been killed. Not a single section of wall had been seriously threatened. The assault was a complete, catastrophic failure. As night fell and the survivors retreated to their camps, Maslama finally understood what his advisors had been trying to tell him for months. Constantinople could not be taken by force. Not with his current resources. Not after the losses they had suffered. The siege was over, whether he admitted it or not. The next morning, Byzantine scouts reported that the Arab camps were being dismantled. Tents were coming down. Equipment was being loaded onto the surviving ships. The army that had come to conquer was preparing to retreat. After 10 months of siege, 10 months of starvation, disease, naval disasters, and futile assaults, the Arabs were finally admitting defeat. But Maslama had one last card to play. He couldn't leave without salvaging some shred of honor. He sent envoys to Emperor Leo with a proposal: allow the Arab army to retreat peacefully, and in exchange, they would leave all their siege equipment and remaining supplies. They would even return Byzantine prisoners taken in earlier battles. Leo's response would determine how this siege finally ended. Emperor Leo III faced a decision that would define his reign. The Arab army was defeated, broken, ready to retreat. He could refuse Maslama's offer and order his forces to pursue and destroy the survivors. It would be vengeance for the suffering Constantinople had endured. It would eliminate a dangerous enemy completely. But it would also cost Byzantine lives, and Leo had kept his people alive through 10 months of siege by making calculated, intelligent choices rather than emotional ones. He chose mercy, but not out of kindness. He chose it because it was strategically sound. Allowing the Arabs to retreat peacefully meant they would leave faster, taking their disease and desperation with them. It meant saving Byzantine soldiers for future battles. And it meant establishing a reputation for honorable conduct that might make future enemies more willing to negotiate rather than fight to the death. On August 15, 718, exactly 1 year after the siege had begun, the Arab army began its withdrawal. It was not a glorious retreat. It was a funeral march. Of the 200,000 soldiers who had arrived, fewer than 70,000 were still alive to leave. The rest had died from starvation, disease, Bulgarian ambushes, or futile assaults. Of the 2,000 ships that had darkened the horizon, barely 400 remained seaworthy. The greatest invasion force the Islamic world had ever assembled had been utterly destroyed. The survivors shambled toward their ships like ghosts, many too weak to carry their own weapons. Byzantine citizens lined the walls to watch them go, not cheering, not celebrating, just witnessing the end of a nightmare. Some threw bread down to the starving Arab soldiers, acts of compassion that transcended the hatred of war. The Arabs loaded their ships in silence, many weeping openly at the scale of their defeat. Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik boarded his flagship and took one last look at Constantinople's walls. He had failed the jihad. He had lost the greatest army ever entrusted to an Arab commander. When he returned to Damascus, he would face the caliph's judgment. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. But at least he was alive, which was more than could be said for the 130,000 men he had led to their deaths. As the Arab fleet sailed south through the Sea of Marmara, one final disaster awaited. A storm struck with unexpected violence, scattering the weakened ships across the water. Many vessels, damaged from months of siege and poorly repaired, simply broke apart in the heavy seas. Others capsized. The storm killed thousands more Arabs who had survived the siege only to drown within sight of safety. When the survivors finally reached Syria weeks later, the Islamic world was stunned by the scale of the catastrophe. The siege of Constantinople had been the single greatest military disaster in the Caliphate's history. The army that was supposed to complete the conquest of the Christian world had been annihilated. The navy that ruled the Mediterranean was shattered. The aura of Arab invincibility was broken. Caliph Umar II, facing internal rebellions and desperate for stability, ordered that there would be no more major campaigns against Constantinople. The city was too well defended. The cost was too high. The Byzantine Empire, which many had expected to collapse within decades, had been granted a new lease on life. Constantinople would stand for another 735 years. Inside the city, Emperor Leo declared 3 days of celebration and thanksgiving. Churches held services praising God for deliverance. The population, which had faced starvation and defeat, had survived through discipline, preparation, and the terrifying power of Greek fire. Leo's reputation transformed overnight from uncertain usurper to savior of Christianity. He had done what seemed impossible. He had defeated the greatest siege in history without losing a single major engagement. But as the celebrations continued, Leo stood on the palace balcony and looked toward the south, where future enemies would inevitably come. Constantinople had survived this time. The secret weapon had worked. The walls had held. The people had endured. But what about next time? Could they do it again? And more importantly, how long could the empire protect the secret of Greek fire before it fell into enemy hands? The victory over the Arab siege transformed Constantinople's status in the medieval world. The city that had stood alone against the most powerful empire on earth had proven that Christian civilization could survive, could resist, could win. Throughout Europe, the news spread like wildfire. Constantinople had held. The Islamic conquest had been stopped. The world would not fall to the Caliphate after all. But Emperor Leo III understood that victory had come at an enormous cost. The city's population had been reduced by disease and starvation. The countryside surrounding Constantinople was devastated. Trade routes were disrupted. The treasury was nearly empty. And most concerning of all, the empire's greatest military secret, Greek fire, had been fully revealed to the Islamic world. During the siege, hundreds of Arab sailors and soldiers had witnessed the weapon in action. Some had even been close enough to see the bronze siphons, the specialized ships, the techniques the Byzantines used to deploy it. Arab engineers and chemists would now be working desperately to recreate the formula. If they succeeded, Constantinople's ultimate advantage would vanish. Leo ordered the security around Greek fire production to be increased to paranoid levels. The workshops where it was manufactured were placed under permanent military guard. The number of people who knew the complete formula was reduced to just 3 imperial chemists, each sworn to die rather than reveal the secret. Any worker involved in production who showed signs of disloyalty was quietly eliminated. The emperor couldn't risk the weapon falling into enemy hands. But security measures couldn't address the larger strategic question: what happened when Greek fire wasn't enough? The Arabs had been stopped in 717 to 718, but they still controlled a vast empire stretching from Spain to India. They had resources, manpower, and religious motivation that would eventually compel them to try again. And next time, they would come better prepared. The Byzantine Empire needed allies. It needed to rebuild its economy. It needed to reform its military and administrative systems. Leo had bought time with Greek fire and brilliant defensive strategy, but time alone wasn't enough. The empire needed fundamental changes to survive the next crisis. Leo began implementing reforms that would reshape Byzantine society. He reorganized the military into a theme system, where soldiers were given land in exchange for service, creating a self-sustaining defensive force. He reformed the tax system to rebuild the treasury. He strengthened the navy and expanded Greek fire production capacity. And controversially, he began challenging the power of the church through iconoclasm, attempting to reduce religious expenditures and redirect resources toward defense. Not all his reforms were popular. The iconoclasm sparked rebellions and religious conflict that would plague the empire for generations. But Leo understood that survival required harsh decisions. Constantinople had won this siege, but the next threat was already forming on the horizon. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Arab Caliphate was digesting the lessons of its catastrophic defeat. They had learned that Constantinople's walls were impregnable to direct assault. They had learned that Greek fire made close naval combat suicidal. They had learned that winter campaigns in hostile territory were disasters. And they had learned that underestimating Byzantine resolve was fatal. Future Arab commanders would be more cautious, more strategic, more patient. They would focus on conquering other targets: Sicily, Crete, Cyprus, gradually surrounding Constantinople rather than attempting another direct siege. They would develop new naval technologies and tactics to counter Greek fire. They would wait for Byzantine weakness before striking again. The siege of 717 to 718 marked a turning point in medieval history. It was the high water mark of Arab expansion into Europe. After this defeat, the Caliphate would never again mount such a massive assault on Constantinople. The city had proven that it could not be easily taken, that Christian resistance was viable, that Islamic conquest was not inevitable. But the victory also revealed something troubling about the Byzantine Empire's future. They had survived only because of a single secret weapon and extraordinary leadership at precisely the right moment. What happened when Leo died? What happened when the secret of Greek fire was inevitably discovered? What happened when the walls aged and the empire weakened? These questions haunted the Byzantine court as celebrations gave way to the hard work of recovery. They had won the battle, but the war for survival would continue for centuries. And each victory would be harder than the last. The legend of Greek fire grew with each passing year after the siege. Across Europe and the Middle East, the weapon became mythologized as a miracle substance, a gift from God, an alchemy that defied natural law. Stories claimed it could burn through stone, that it was created from dragon's blood, that only those blessed by angels could manufacture it. The truth was extraordinary enough, but myth made it immortal. For the Byzantine Empire, this mythological status became a strategic asset. Even when Greek fire wasn't actually being used, The threat of it was enough to deter enemies. Arab fleets approached Byzantine waters with extreme caution. Pirates avoided Byzantine shipping lanes. Rival powers thought twice before challenging Constantinople's naval supremacy. Fear became as powerful as the weapon itself. But mythology couldn't hide the fact that Greek fire had significant limitations. It required specialized ships to deploy effectively. It was expensive to produce, requiring rare ingredients imported from distant lands. It worked best in calm seas against wooden ships, conditions that didn't always exist in combat. And most critically, it was a defensive weapon. Greek fire could protect Constantinople, but it couldn't help the empire reconquer lost territories. Emperor Leo III understood these limitations and worked to develop a comprehensive military strategy that didn't rely solely on one secret weapon. He invested heavily in conventional naval forces, created elite infantry units, and established a system of fortified cities across the empire. Greek fire was the shield, but the empire needed swords as well. The Arab Caliphate, meanwhile, was adapting. Engineers studied the accounts from survivors of the 717 to 718 siege. They experimented with fireproof materials, treating sails and ship hulls with vinegar, clay, and alum to reduce flammability. They developed new ship designs with greater spacing between vessels to prevent fire from spreading. They trained sailors in anti-fire tactics, including the use of sand and blankets to smother flames. More importantly, Arab strategists shifted their focus. If Constantinople couldn't be taken by direct assault, they would weaken it indirectly. They launched campaigns against Byzantine territories in Sicily, southern Italy, and the Mediterranean islands. They raided coastal cities, disrupting trade and draining imperial resources. They supported rebellions within Byzantine borders, creating internal chaos that didn't require facing Greek fire at all. This new strategy proved effective. Over the following decades, the Byzantine Empire slowly lost territory. Not through catastrophic defeats, but through gradual erosion. Cities fell one by one. Trade routes were cut. Provinces rebelled. The empire that had triumphantly survived the 717 to 718 siege found itself slowly bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts. Greek fire remained effective in naval combat, but it couldn't solve political instability, economic decline, or the simple mathematics of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The weapon that had saved Constantinople became a symbol of the empire's larger problem. Brilliant tactics couldn't compensate for strategic weakness. In 741, Emperor Leo III died, having ruled for 24 years since the siege. His son, Constantine V, inherited an empire that was stable but challenged. The immediate crisis had passed, but long-term survival remained uncertain. Constantine continued his father's military reforms and used Greek fire effectively in several naval victories, but he also faced constant threats from Arabs, Bulgarians, and internal religious conflicts. The formula for Greek fire remained secret, passed from one imperial chemist to another through oral tradition. But as decades passed, the number of people who knew the complete formula shrank. When one chemist died unexpectedly without fully training his replacement, parts of the knowledge were lost. The Byzantines could still produce Greek fire, but the quality became inconsistent. Some batches burned as fiercely as ever. Others fizzled ineffectively. By the 9th century, Greek fire was still being used in Byzantine naval warfare, but its reputation exceeded its reality. The weapon remained effective enough to deter major naval assaults on Constantinople, but it was no longer the unstoppable force of legend. Enemy navies had learned to counter it. The Byzantines themselves had partially forgotten how to produce it at peak effectiveness. And yet, the myth persisted. Stories of burning seas and unstoppable flames continued to terrify potential enemies. Sometimes, the legend of a weapon is more powerful than the weapon itself. Constantinople's walls and the memory of what happened to the Arab fleet in 717 to 718 kept the city safe for centuries. But eventually, every secret is revealed. Every weapon is countered. Every empire falls. The secret of Greek fire was never fully stolen by enemies, but it was lost to time. As the Byzantine Empire declined over the following centuries, the specialized knowledge required to produce the weapon degraded generation by generation. Master chemists died before fully training their apprentices. Political turmoil disrupted the careful secrecy protocols. Economic crises made it harder to import the rare ingredients required for the formula. By the 12th century, the Byzantines were still producing something they called Greek fire, but contemporary accounts suggest it was no longer the devastating superweapon that had destroyed the Arab fleet in 718. It still burned, still created fear, but it lacked the terrifying intensity of the original formula. The exact proportions, the specific mixing techniques, the precise temperature controls, all the details that made Greek fire uniquely powerful, had been lost to history. Ironically, the very secrecy that protected the weapon for centuries also ensured its eventual disappearance. By never writing down the formula, by limiting knowledge to a handful of individuals, the Byzantines guaranteed that a single break in the chain of transmission could lose the secret forever. And that's exactly what happened. Modern historians and chemists have attempted to recreate Greek fire based on historical descriptions and chemical analysis of ancient vessels. The consensus is that it likely contained a mixture of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and naphtha, possibly with additional secret ingredients. When mixed correctly and pressurized, this combination could create a substance that ignited on contact with water and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. But knowing the ingredients isn't the same as knowing the formula. The precise proportions, the order of mixing, the temperature controls, the pressure systems, all these technical details died with the last chemist who knew them completely. Greek fire became a historical mystery, a lost technology that modern science can approximate but never perfectly recreate. The broader lesson transcends the weapon itself. Greek fire saved Constantinople in 717 to 718, but it couldn't save the Byzantine Empire from inevitable decline. No single weapon, no matter how advanced, can substitute for sound strategy, economic strength, political stability, and diplomatic intelligence. The Byzantines won the siege because they combined the secret weapon with brilliant leadership, careful preparation, unexpected alliances, and sheer determination. When those other factors eroded over the following centuries, Greek fire alone wasn't enough. The empire gradually lost territory, influence, and power. Constantinople remained unconquered for another 735 years after the 717 to 718 siege, protected more by its legendary walls and strategic location than by any secret weapon. But in 1453, the city finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, who conquered it not with superior weapons but with superior strategy, resources, and determination. By then, Greek fire was a distant memory. The Byzantines had long since forgotten how to produce it. The siege of 1453 was won with massive cannons and overwhelming force, not countered with mysterious flames and chemical warfare. The weapon that had once seemed invincible had vanished, leaving only legends and historical accounts. Today, Greek fire exists as a symbol of lost knowledge, of technologies that advanced civilizations developed and then forgot. It reminds us that human progress is not linear, that knowledge can be lost as easily as gained, and that even the most powerful innovations eventually become obsolete or forgotten. But the siege of 717 to 718 remains one of the most remarkable military achievements in history. A city of 500,000 people, isolated and surrounded, defeated the greatest invasion force of the medieval era. They did it through preparation, intelligence, courage, and yes, a secret weapon that turned the sea into fire. Emperor Leo III, the Byzantine defenders, and the chemists who guarded the formula of Greek fire achieved something extraordinary. They changed the course of European history. If Constantinople had fallen in 718, Islam would have controlled both sides of the Bosphorus. The conquest of Eastern Europe would likely have followed. The entire trajectory of Western civilization would have been fundamentally different. Greek fire didn't just save a city. In a very real sense, it helped save a civilization. And that legacy, unlike the formula itself, will never be forgotten. The siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718 stands as one of history's great what-if moments. What if the Byzantines hadn't possessed Greek fire? What if Emperor Leo III had been less competent? What if the Bulgarian Khan Tervel hadn't allied with Constantinople? What if the winter had been milder, or the Arab supply lines more secure? Any of these variables changing could have resulted in the city's fall and a completely different world. Historical analysis reveals that the siege's outcome wasn't predetermined. The Arabs had every reason to expect victory. They had superior numbers, better supplies, more experience conquering fortified cities, and religious motivation that made retreat unthinkable. On paper, Constantinople should have fallen. That it didn't represents a perfect convergence of preparation, leadership, technology, and luck. Greek fire was critical, but it wasn't the only factor. The Theodosian walls, built 3 centuries earlier, proved their worth by making direct assault impossible. Emperor Leo's advanced preparations, including stockpiling food and negotiating with the Bulgarians, created the conditions for survival. The harsh winter, which couldn't be predicted or controlled, devastated the Arab army more than any weapon. And Maslama's strategic errors, particularly maintaining the siege through winter when retreat would have been wiser, compounded the disaster. The lesson for modern readers is that decisive moments in history rarely depend on a single factor. Victory comes from preparation meeting opportunity, from combining technological advantage with strategic intelligence, from making the right choices under impossible pressure. The Byzantines didn't just have a secret weapon. They had a system, military, political, technological, and diplomatic, that allowed them to leverage that weapon effectively. The broader impact of the siege extended far beyond Constantinople's walls. The Arab defeat in 718 marked the end of rapid Islamic expansion into Europe. While Muslim forces would later conquer Sicily, Crete, and parts of southern Italy, they never again mounted such a comprehensive assault on the Byzantine heartland. The momentum of conquest, which had seemed unstoppable for a century, was finally broken. For the Byzantine Empire, the victory provided centuries of additional existence. The empire would face many more crises, would lose and regain territories, would experience golden ages and periods of decline. But Constantinople itself remained unconquered until 1453, a testament to the effectiveness of its fortifications and the strategic importance of its location. The city that Greek fire saved became the longest surviving capital of the ancient world, preserving classical knowledge and culture that would later spark the European Renaissance. The story of Greek fire itself became legendary, inspiring medieval imagination and modern curiosity. The idea of a lost superweapon, a chemical formula so powerful and so secret that it vanished from history, captures something essential about human innovation and fragility. We create extraordinary things, and then we lose them. Knowledge that seems permanent proves temporary. Empires that seem eternal eventually fall. But some achievements transcend their own time. The defense of Constantinople in 717 to 718 wasn't just a military victory. It was a demonstration that determination and intelligence can overcome overwhelming odds. It proved that a well-defended position, competently led and properly supplied, can defeat a much larger force. It showed that technological innovation, when properly protected and deployed, can change the balance of power. Emperor Leo III died not knowing how history would remember him. He couldn't foresee that the siege he survived would be studied by military historians for over a millennium. He didn't know that Greek fire would become one of history's great mysteries, debated and analyzed centuries after its formula was lost. He simply made the best decisions he could with the information available, protected his people with every tool at his disposal, and refused to surrender even when defeat seemed inevitable. That's the final lesson of Constantinople's siege. Courage matters. Preparation matters. Intelligence matters. Technology matters. But more than anything, the refusal to give up when all seems lost, that matters most of all. The Arab fleet arrived with 2,000 ships. Greek fire sent them home with barely 400. The weapon that made the sea burn saved a city, an empire, and possibly a civilization. And though the formula is lost, the story remains, a reminder that sometimes, against impossible odds, the defenders win. And sometimes, that changes everything.